Well, thank you so much, Nabina and Marina, for organizing this massive week of game theory. I think we're all incredibly refreshed by it, at least I am, given the state of the world. So I'm going to speak to you today about a project that David and I have been talking about for some time, and we really appreciate the chance to present. So we're going to be talking about social networks in the market for news. And what is the, hold on, I can get my screen to advance. What is the inspiration for this talk or this paper? Not surprisingly, we got into this, as a lot of people did, thinking about this phenomenon or this notion of fake news. But we should recognize that this idea that there's news out there which is false, that is put out there to support an end, is nothing new. In fact, the British intelligence put out newsreels in the United States to get the America to enter World War II. So that's not particularly new, that there can be agents out there trying to influence the operation of the news market and to inject particular pieces of information. The contemporary media market, though, is particularly interesting. There are now many providers of news, so it's not just the British intelligence services that can do this sort of thing. Obviously, there's regular old brick and mortar providers, there's bloggers, the troll factories, the famous people who live in basements who can produce news of a sort. And of course, we're working in a world where consumers share news in social media. So any particular news item has a large potential reach. And consumers are possibly more sophisticated, possibly, and can have access to fact-checking if they want to go that route. So what David and I are doing here is we're building what we think of as a simple model of news demand in a social network. And then we're also going to be thinking about news supply. So let me just give you an overview. We're going to have rational consumers who value true news. So unlike some talks that were previously during the week, our news consumers are not biased. They simply want to know if a piece of news is true. That's it. That's all they care about. They have no bias. A consumer can fact check a piece of news and then decide whether to share it and act on it. So I read a piece of news, maybe it's in a Twitter feed, or I read a news article. I say, do I believe that? And I may fact check or not, or I consult my own sources. So we're going to obviously model that as some sort of private signal. And then I say, oh, I want to, tell you guys about it, tell my friends about it. Or it may affect the way I vote or a candidate that I might support. Now, when consumers are connected through a network, this fact checking and this decision to share the news can both filter the news. So I'm only going to send on something which I think is true. And it also then can spread the news widely. Now, if the veracity of the news were fixed, so all news, news were, had some fixed probability of actually being true, this social network and this fact checking and sharing would always be increasing consumer welfare, because consumers would only share things they thought were sufficiently likely to be true, and then the other consumers would then see that and act on that kind of news. However, news veracity is not exogenous, it's endogenous. And so we think this is the contribution of the paper, is that we're going to think about a producer responding to what the network does with the product that it sells. So we're build a simple model of news supply where we have profit maximizing producers. There are costs to publishing high quality news, which we're going to equate to true news. We're going to make a slight, a connection between those two, so quality and truth. And then we're also going to make a distinction between different news revenue sources, so revenue sources for the producers. So producers could either earn their revenues from simply consumers seeing their news item or consumers acting on their news item. And again, we think the innovation of this paper in the larger space of this literature, which I'll give you a big literature slide in a bit, is that we're endogenizing the product, which then gets diffused through the network. So that's a general point. Now, to fix ideas for the current application, let me give you some examples. So let's take a traditional news outlet. like the New York Times. So the New York Times publishes an article. It's printed, it's broadcast, somebody reads it. The consumer sees the news and decides to share or not with friends. Of course, we know that there's a way you can share these articles. The consumer then, of course, could take actions or not based on that news. But the New York Times largely gets revenues from the advertising that accompanies the article. So the more people that see this piece of news, the more revenue the New York Times would get. There are false news sites, the famous one being Denver Guardian, which again looks kind of like a news site, but it's not. And what they're doing is basically publishing this fake news, and they're just getting money from the advertising that accompanies the news item. So the more people that share this particular Denver Guardian article, the more Denver Guardian is going to get people like Gladstone Cold Weather Apparel to advertise on their site. There, of course, are news sites that have more explicit political agendas, excuse me, so consumers can view, share, and possibly act on that news as well. These outlets are indeed also earning money from advertising, right? But they're also earning revenues or returns, let's say, from the actions that consumers take based on their news that's published. And of course, going back to the British intelligence services or the common things we see now, the troll factories and other perhaps government-based news sources, these places would get revenues largely based on consumers' actions on the news. So here's just an example of a fake news page by something called the Heart of Texas, which actually was a Russian-created site that led to an actual protest in Texas. So just to give an example. So our model is going to capture this process. In period t = 0, in the beginning, reporters are going to choose the quality of the news that they're going to produce. And that quality is going to give the probability that that news is true or false. And of course, I'll be building this model in a little bit. Then the producers then broadcast the news. The mix of true and false stories gives the expected news veracity. Consumers read any particular piece of news and get a private signal and say, what do I think? Is this true or false? Consumers will then update from the prior P0 and then, given their private signal, decide whether or not to share the piece of news. That leads to the visibility of a particular piece of story, a particular news story. So consumers then see shared stories, and in a model that's where there's revenues from views, right? That will generate producers' revenues from those views. So the advertising revenue. And the difference in revenue from having produced a true story versus a false story is that what feeds back into the reporters' incentives.
Is there a cost of, is the cost of producing
yes
higher than producing F?
Yes, I'll give you the details. Yes, absolutely. And I'll give you those details when we get to the model. Okay. So this model is just slightly different, but it's going to have very big implications for the results. So now the producer is not earning revenues from the views, but from consumers' actions. So it's the same beginning. Reporters are choosing this quality, true or it gives you the truth or the false of a piece of news. They broadcast it. That gives a expected veracity of the news items. Consumers then know that, they get their private signal, they decide to share or not. And this is the part that's different. Consumers then make an inference based on the sharing behavior of their neighbors in their network, and then say, if I see a lot of people sharing this story, it must mean that a lot of them got a signal that it was a true piece of news. And then consumers then will act on the story. That leads to these action payoffs, and the difference between the payoffs from producing a true piece of news and a false piece of news is what feeds back into the reporters' incentives. So the different revenues is going to clearly lead to different incentives in the very first stage. Okay, so let me summarize the results. First of all, we are going to show you there's a, the equilibrium set for this market for news. And one thing that we can show, that sort of comes out immediately is that some false news must circulate in any equilibrium where producers are producing true news, right? If producers were only producing true news, consumers would then always pass it along. And then, of course, since producing true news is costly, as we just mentioned, you know, that high quality true news is costly, and of course, a producer then would then have an incentive to deviate. So any functional news market has to have some false news circulating. Now, what about producers, the case where producers' revenues are for consumers' views? Here, a network that is highly dense will actually lead to more false news. And again, the intuition here is, again, pretty straightforward. If the network is very dense, even false news will spread widely. And so therefore, a producer will have less incentive to produce a true piece of news. So all you have to do is get through one or two consumers, and and those consumers have a lot of neighbors which they're sharing, and so your false news then spreads very widely. We do an exercise where we add misinformation agents. So the producers I've been talking to you about just so far are all bona fide news producers that either earn money from ads or earn money from consumers' actions. But we are going to add misinformation agents who are, I gave you some of those examples earlier. And we're just going to see what happens when we inject some misinformation agents. And we can see that in some cases, misinformation agents can actually give bona fide news producers greater incentive to produce true news. And the logic here is that if there's more false news being produced by these misinformation agents, consumers, they know that, they're going to be more judicious about sharing news. And so therefore, there's less profit from producing a false piece of news. You want to get through that consumer's filter, and it's harder to do so when there's misinformation out there. And so you have to produce true news, which is going to pass the consumer's fact check at a greater rate. Now, what about when producers earn revenues from consumers' actions? So now this is the voting model. You know, the producers are political actors in some sense, and they're interested in consumers acting in a particular way. Here, a highly dense network will lead to more true news. So remember, just going back, when producers only cared about consumers viewing the news, high network density led to false news. But if producers care about consumers' actions, then high density would lead to the opposite. It would lead to more true news. And here, the producers care about consumers' inferences about the news truth. They don't just care that a consumer sees the piece of news. They care what consumers infer about the news truth from the sharing behavior that goes on in the network. And so here we see that actually news that is produced by actors that care about consumers' actions is more likely to be true than a news producer that is just producing so that people see the news. Okay, so that's a summary of the result. Of course, a gigantic literature that that relates to various aspects of this model. There's, of course, the media. There's a media literature. There's now studies of fake news in particular. There's a social learning literature, opinion information networks, and so on. So, of course, I don't have time in this short format to go through the literature. What I do want to emphasize, though, is that what we do in this paper, which is different from this literature, all of this literature, is that we have a third party who's outside the network, and this third party is making a decision that is completely influenced by how the network reacts to its decision. So we have an endogenous product. The product quality is endogenous. What diffuses through the network is affected by the network, and vice versa. Okay, so here's the model. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. We have a large number of producers. It could, by the way, this also could be one producer, but easy enough to have a large number of producers. All we need is a producer that can't make a commitment to a quality level. There's a random cost to producing a high quality story. So that cost we're labeling CR and has a distribution H. We're going to equate quality to truth. And we could fiddle around with this and make it, parameterize it, but the basic force is that it's costly to produce true news. So there's high quality news is true with probability 1, low quality news is true with probability 0. producers cannot commit to high quality and consumers cannot directly observe quality. So of course that's key. P0, you've seen that notation before, is what we're calling news veracity. So that is the probability that any particular piece of news that's produced is true. So it's the expected truth. That might be a way to talk about that. Okay, and what about the demand side? There are N consumers who are linked in a directed network, G, and D is I's in degree. So each consumer is followed by D others. Let me just move my picture here. You know, so well, it goes both ways. Any one consumer follows D other consumers. Then we have M revenue generating consumers. So some subset of these N consumers actually generate revenue. And the reason we have M rather than N generating revenue generating consumers is that we want to allow the market to grow in terms of the links. We want more and more links without changing the revenue base. So we want to hold fixed the revenue base and then just think about the connectivity in the network. Hold on. Wait, no, not moving. Okay. Consumers, as I said, are completely rational here in the sense that they only value true news. So they want to share true news and not share false news. And they want to act on true news and not act on false news. Oops. So from these payoffs, we can simply write a threshold belief for sharing or acting on a piece of news. So a consumer, if we make these payoffs symmetric, then a consumer will want to share a piece of news or act on a piece of news if the probability that it is true is greater than or equal to a half. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this fact check, which I described, or this private signal. So if the news is actually true, a consumer will receive a signal T, which we'll often call a good signal, with some probability rho greater than a half. If the news is actually false, a consumer would receive the signal F, which we also sometimes refer to as a bad signal, with probability rho greater than a half. So then, of course, the consumer can simply update the prior belief is P0, and the posterior, you just calculate the posterior belief given either having received a signal T or a signal F. So it might help to have a picture of how this works, the consumer side works. And now I'm sort of going to be following that mapping I had earlier in the introduction. So this is the consumer network. We've got consumers, you know, this consumer follows this guy here. This guy here is actually followed by two people, this one and this one. So we've got a directed network. And we've got these news producers. The news producers, they make decision on this quality, which generates this news veracity, P0. They broadcast the news. Each consumer receives any piece of news with probability B. So now let's think about this particular consumer up here. This consumer has received a piece of news and has the prior belief of P0. This consumer says, oh, what should I do? Should I share this piece of news or not with my neighbors? So the consumer fact checks, takes a look and gets a signal, T or F. And if the posterior probability is sufficiently high, the consumer then would share the news. So if this consumer got a signal T, the consumer then, you know, gets his posterior and possibly shares the news with his neighbors. So that's how the process of sharing works, fact check and sharing works. So what we are going to solve for in this model is for a market equilibrium. So we're looking for supply equal to demand. So given our information assumptions, we essentially have a simultaneous move game. Consumers are playing a best reply where they're going to share given some news veracity P0, and producers' best reply is to produce high or low quality, which gives the P0 given consumer sharing behavior. So we're going to be focusing here on the Nash equilibria and specifically the symmetric stable Nash equilibria. So the symmetry part is not particularly important. We just want all consumers to be doing the same thing. So if they're mixing at a particular rate, they're all going to be mixing at the same rate, for example. Stability just eliminates one equilibrium. Okay, so let's go through the equilibrium analysis. Okay, so first, let's take a look at the consumer's response. So remember, the consumer is responding to this P0. So consumers have this sharing rule given P0, and the little notation here, ZT is the probability of sharing after seeing a signal T, and ZF is the probability of sharing after seeing a signal F. And as we were just going through, since we have this threshold of 1/2, the consumer will share if and only if the posterior is greater than 1/2, which will give us this behavior. So here we're starting given P0. If P0 is in the range 0 to 1 minus rho, the consumer does not share any piece of news. Regardless of the signal, the consumer will not pass that piece of news along. At exactly 1 minus rho, the consumer will then start to share a piece of news after seeing a signal T, but not yet after a signal F. And in this range here between 1 minus rho and rho, remember, whoops, didn't mean to do that. In this range between 1 minus rho and rho, right in here, this is where the consumer is sharing after a signal T, but not after a signal F. When we reach this threshold rho, here's where the consumer then starts to share after seeing a signal F. So there's always sharing after seeing a signal T, and sometimes sharing after a signal F. So the consumer is indifferent between sharing after signal F right at P0 equals rho. And then in this region, the prior is so high that the news is true that the consumer always shares regardless of regardless of their private signal. So that's the consumer's optimal sharing behavior. Let's look at the producer's optimal production. And we're going to look at the revenues from views model first, and mainly during the talk. So given consumer sharing behavior, the producer will have the notation, these revenues, the view revenues from producing a true piece of news and the view revenues from a false piece of news. And then we have the extra revenues from true news, which gives the producer the incentive to produce that true news. So the producer will produce high quality whenever the realization of the production cost is sufficiently low. And remember, M are the number of revenue producing consumers. And that's what gives us the news veracity level. So now we need to put these two together. We have the producer's best reply, which I just went through, and previously I went through the consumer's best reply. So let's put them together. So I'm going to now map out the optimal production for the producers on a little map here, where again I've got the consumer's reply here, Z. So when consumers are not sharing at all, of course the producers are not going to be producing at all. But as consumers start to share after seeing a signal T, the producers will start producing high quality until it reaches its highest level that a producer would ever want to produce. And as the consumers start to share more and more, eventually, remember that false news is also going through, so that reduces the amount of, that reduces the balance of true and false news, so the overall veracity starts to fall. At exactly this point, we are just labeling it for the construction of our arguments. When the consumer is sharing only after T, but not all the time after T, but not after F, that's a particularly benchmark point. So it's pure filtering. And of course, as the consumer is sharing after seeing a signal F more and more frequently, the producer has less and less incentive to produce high quality news because all news is going through. So this is the producer's best reply. And then on the same picture, we're going to map the consumer's best reply. So this is the consumer's best reply that I just went through a few slides ago. And then we put the two together and we have a way to characterize the equilibria. So this is what we call a functional equilibrium. In this equilibrium, the producers are producing some true news. It's exactly at the level, the news veracity is exactly at the level rho, and consumers are sharing always after a true signal and sometimes after a false signal. this is our dynamically unstable equilibrium. And of course, we do have a dysfunctional equilibrium where consumers never share and producers never produce high quality news. So the equilibrium set is characterized by this cost distribution H. So this is the picture I just showed you, right? And as costs become higher, we have a way to parameterize the level of production costs. Basically what's happening is this producer best reply keeps shifting down and down. And of course, if production is very, very high, if it's very, very costly to produce high quality news, then the only equilibrium is this dysfunctional one here. So that characterizes our equilibrium set. So we have a unique equilibrium or unique functional equilibrium that is stable. Okay. All right, so now let's do what we think is perhaps the more interesting parts of this model, is to introduce these misinformation agents. So now let's consider a mass M of misinformation agents along the mass 1 of bona fide producers. So that everything I talked about before, we're going to make them all mass 1, and now we have a mass M of misinformation agents. So the total quantity of news is 1 plus M, and the high quality news is P0 Z, because our misinformation agents are only producing false news. I actually don't have that on the slide, it should be. The misinformation agents only produce false news. So the share of total news is true, of course, it's just the share of high quality, is the veracity of the bona fide producers over the total volume of news, the total quantity of news. Okay, so if there was a fixed level of high quality news, then it's clear that M would decrease total news veracity, right? But in our model, high quality news production is not fixed. Producers are going to change what they produce for given levels of M. So we think we have this pretty interesting result. The first one's not the interesting one. The interesting one's the second one. Obviously, if there's a high enough M, if the market is flooded with false news, the market is dysfunctional. There will be no high quality production. But, and here is what we actually think the world might be in right now. If the costs of producing news are sufficiently low, I'll describe, that gets us that equilibrium, the first equilibrium I showed you in the first picture. Then injecting some smaller amount of M can actually increase high quality news production. And what's going on here, again, is that consumers are going to be sharing news less often after they see a signal F. And that will give producers, the bona fide producers, a greater incentive to produce high quality news. So let's see how that works in our picture. So this is just one of the equilibrium pictures I showed you before. This is the one where the costs are sufficiently low so that we've got the functional equilibrium over here at the highest possible level we could have news veracity exactly at rho. Now we're going to introduce a little bit of M, a little bit of misinformation. A little bit of information, right? That shifting, that gives us this graph here, right? This graph right here. And this will be the new equilibrium. The veracity level is the same, right? But there is M, which wasn't there before. So producers must be producing higher quality stories to counteract this higher M. And what's going on here is that consumers are sharing less often. So before they were sharing with this star probability after seeing an F, but with this injection of misinformation, consumers are sharing more judiciously, they're sharing less often, and that gives the bona fide producers a greater incentive to produce high quality news. Now, of course, as we keep increasing M, eventually we would just have the unique equilibrium is this dysfunctional equilibrium where, excuse me, no quality news is being produced. Okay. All right. So now let's do another, again, exercise of interest here, which is see the comparative statics with respect to the network density D. What happens when we increase the density of the network? So here we have a non-monotonic effect of increasing the network density. So if there's a low density, increase in D is going to increase news veracity. So again, just start out with, a person has one link, they're following one other person, and now they're following 2 or 3. What's happening there is that the returns to producing a true piece of news are going to be increasing faster than the returns to producing a false piece of news. So true news is shared marginally more often. Producers are going to, getting through that filter, they're going from 1 to 2 to 3 consumers. And they're going to have a greater incentive and greater additional incentive to produce true news than false news. But if we have a very dense network, an increase in D would actually decrease news veracity. This is what I mentioned in the introduction. At this point, even false news is spreading very widely. So the returns for producing, the marginal returns for producing up to a piece of false news are growing faster than those for a true piece of news. So if you have an extremely dense network, I mean, just think, just do the thought experiment, extremely dense network, any piece of news gets through, you might as well do it. Why pay any cost? So of course we do have a limiting result of that sort, but we also have it all along the way for each finite D. And of course you can see immediately that there is a critical D. So below which, if you increase the density, you get more true news, and for higher densities, if you increase D, you get more false news. Now there is a message here relative to the literature out there on the media. There's these wonderful papers that show that advertising revenue actually decreased dependence on sponsors and therefore reduced news media bias. But in today's connected world, that might not hold anymore, because revenue based on advertising, as we just said, can involve lower quality. So if a newspaper historically no longer had to rely on a sponsor for its operating costs and to pay the reporters, and could rely only on advertising revenue, then it reduced bias. It doesn't really speak to truth. So our paper is more about the truth. If your revenue is based on advertising only, well, then if you can produce anything and everyone's going to see it, you might as well produce junk, right? And that's kind of the today's connected world. So it could be that maybe we need to go back to thinking about what about news producers that earn revenues based on consumers' actions on their news, not just the fact that you can, sell something, that people will see an ad next to their piece of news. So this is the denverguardian.com world, right? Revenue and advertising, just put something out there, it gets through, somebody's going to pay, some ad is going to accompany it, some ad, you can sell space on your site to an advertiser. But that might not hold, and we're going to show does not hold, where the producers do care about consumers believing their news. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through quickly the model where a producer gets revenues from the actions. And we're going to do this in the limit case with a very, very large D. So for given any particular news veracity, we know that in equilibrium, a person J knows the probability of I sharing a piece of news. So J is going to observe some level sigma out of his neighbors sharing, and J is also going to observe his own signal, and consumer J will then have some posterior belief after seeing his own signal T and his own signal F. Well, as D gets sufficiently large, the consumer is going to be able to infer perfectly whether a piece of news is true or false, because all of his neighbors, his infinitely many neighbors, are getting these signals, and he can tell from the proportion of his neighbors which are sharing a piece of news whether the news is true or false. So consumers can perfectly discern a true or false story. The true stories are going to earn this revenue M. False stories are going to earn no revenue. And in our functional equilibrium, we will have a news veracity at exactly the cost related to producing for M consumers. So we can easily show then that a news market where producers earn revenues from actions will produce higher quality news, higher truth news, than a market where producers only get revenue from advertising that accompanies their news stories. Okay, so let me quickly summarize. We have a simple model of a market for news. The consumers are, again, are rational, which is different than a lot of the news market media bias articles out there. Consumers are rational. They value sharing and adopting true news. Producers are profit maximizing, where they bear a higher cost for producing true news. Equilibria exist with high quality news production, but false news circulates in any equilibrium where high quality news is produced. Higher network density can increase the production of false news. Misinformation can also increase the high quality production of, the production of high quality news. And revenues from consumers' actions, if producers actually care that consumers believe their news, that can improve news quality and the truth of the news. Okay, so some further questions out there. So of course, we think this is a bit of a jumping off point for the study of these kinds of news markets where consumers are affecting the choices of producers. So these links clearly have information externalities. So what are the role of social media to possibly subsidize the link costs if we were to have endogenous network links? A lot of questions come up about the industrial organization on the producer side. So our producers, as you see, they're extraordinarily simple. They cannot, the only thing that we assume about them is that they cannot commit to, that they cannot commit to quality, but we only have one of them. So what if we had many news producers that were possibly competing with each other? What if they introduced a subscription business model? And what about people curating news, deciding to curate the news? And that would impact that would almost be a way to stop consumers sharing. And so if advertising is bad, maybe we want people to sort of restrict if advertising affects news quality in the way that our model says it might, then we might actually want to stop consumers from sharing as much. And a big set of questions about a multi-dimensional news products. Our news is either true or false. There's a lot of work out there that there's other characteristics of news which makes it very shareable. You know, people like to share news that is surprising, is humorous, is perhaps shocking. So if we added a multi-dimensional news product, and how might that interact with the news truth in the production and the spread of news? So thank you very much. And David and I will be very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Rachel. So we have a few minutes for questions if there are any.
So I have a question, Rachel. I was trying to understand your first result when the revenue comes from advertising. And I typically think that if we have more connectivity, then the precision of the fact-checking technology is less important. They're like sort of substitutes. Is your result saying the opposite, that as we are more connected, actually I should be investing in having a better fact-checking technology?
So I missed one sentence in what you said. Can you state it again?
So whether I think that connectivity and fact-checking are substitutes or not, I typically think that they are, but your first result suggests exactly the opposite, right?
I'm not sure I'd say that. I think that regardless of what the fact-check technology is, if you're sufficiently well connected, the fact-checking technology is not really helping you, because it doesn't really stop anything, because you can just spread any piece of news infinitely widely. So it's not actually serving as a gatekeeper. If you want to think of the fact-checking technology as preventing spread. Right. But if then the spread just happens, right? No fact-checking technology can, unless it becomes infinitely precise. So we haven't modeled this, but I'm imagining we have sort of an infinitely precise, a signal that gets infinitely well precise, as well as a market that gets, infinitely dense. Maybe those two would then start interacting. Right now we have a fact-checking technology that's fixed, and we increase D, and we increase the density.
And you take it to the limit.
We take that to the limit, right? And so no matter what row is, as long as it's fixed.
It's going to spread out, right?
Right.
I got
Right.
it now. Thank you.
Yeah, but that's a good, David might want
Rachel, can I
to
add
add something.
a different way of answering the question is that
Sure.
as network density changes, the informativeness of others' behavior changes. So they're following different sharing rules, and hence you learn different amounts. So,
Right.
so one reason adding a lot of links is leading to this result is that you're not learning as much from your neighbors. And if you're not learning as much from your neighbors, you might want to invest in a different type of signal. We do not endogenize the signal. So that
Exactly. So that's the sense in which this substitutability that I had in mind is exactly the opposite, right? So when I add links is when I would like to have actually a better fact-checking technology. So that's exactly
Right.
it.
And again, so
yeah.
our two answers were I was going towards the revenue from views model, and David was, I think, talking about the revenue, or both about also the revenue from actions model. And you know, the implications of the fact-checking technology and the D are different in the two of those.
Okay, great. Thank you.